This is Second Chance with You, Baxter Boys, Book 4. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Chapter 1. Riley Coleman's phone buzzed. She kept her hands folded in her lap and didn't move. That terminal is sitting at the confluence of the Turnpike, I-80 and I-99, right in the middle of central Pennsylvania. We're perfectly positioned to be everywhere and go anywhere. Her dad's booming voice filled the corner office of Coleman Trucking and Repair Incorporated in Spruce Mountain, Maine. Her phone stopped buzzing. Riley didn't twitch. It should be our top-performing shop. It should be number one in the country. We have state-of-the-art computer systems and mechanics from the top schools anywhere. His face brightened like the red of her mother's old countertops. But it's not. It's the worst-performing diesel garage we own, the bottom in just about every measurable area. Their company had a trucking division and a repair division with a fleet of 200 trucks and 10 repair terminals scattered over the country. The location they were currently at was the original one. Her dad stood up, tall, as always, with a slightly larger waistline than when Riley had last seen him at Christmas time. It's not just because you're my daughter. It's because you've made this shop in Nowherestown, Maine, the best-performing shop in the country. The job in Pennsylvania is yours by rights. Riley rose as well. Only his old office desk, ponderous and glowering, stood between them. I can do the job. Her voice sounded capable and bold, a direct contrast to the timorous skittering of her heart. Bold as brass. That's what you've always been. Her dad smiled, a pleased, I'm proud of my daughter smile, the kind she lived for. She gave him a cool, confident smile in return, the smile she'd perfected over the years of demanding confrontations when her father insisted on and expected almost superhuman effort from her. But everything she'd worked for was almost within reach. Make the shop in Pennsylvania successful, get the corner office, see her dad's approval. I need you down in Brickley Springs in 3 weeks, tops. I'll be there, she said, her confident tone covering her chaotic thoughts. Less than 21 days to wrap things up at the shop in Maine, move out of her apartment, and find somewhere to live. No problem, Dad. He nodded, pacing behind his desk. His boots made a soft clomp on the tile floor. Outside the large windows, the late Maine spring was just turning the grass at the edge of the big truck parking area a happy shade of green, a direct contrast to the dark paneling and neutral colors of what used to be his office, until 10 years ago when he expanded his company and moved with his family to Pennsylvania. Riley had grown up in Maine and had only left for college. She'd worked in the company all her life, working her way through college at the shop in Pennsylvania before coming back to Maine 6 years ago. She'd become the manager 4 years ago. The same time Ben Baxter had been made shop foreman. Riley's control slipped, and she pulled both lips between her teeth before she forced the tension out of her body and smoothed the features on her face. She wasn't going to think about Ben Baxter. Except, if she wanted the shop in Pennsylvania to be successful, she didn't have a choice. Not only would she have to think about him, she'd have to convince him to move to Brickley Springs. Ben Baxter set the last injector carefully on the plyboard and sawhorse makeshift table. He pulled the blue rag out of his back pocket and started wiping his hands, looking around at the almost deserted shop. Hey, boss, I'm leaving. Fred Tomlin, his gray hair sticking out from under his ball cap in wispy strands, stopped beside the gutted Peterbilt Ben had been working on. "Thanks for staying and giving me a hand with that core." Ben shoved the rag back in his pocket. "You still have a meeting with the fancy lady?" Fred asked with a smirk. Riley Coleman wasn't hated around the shop. She was a fair manager and nice to look at, but with her business suits and perfectly shiny hair and nails, she would never be on their level, which made her an outsider. Ben never bothered defending her, not after what she'd done to him. "Yep." Ben wiped the last of his wrenches off and set it back neatly in the drawer with the rest of the set. "She should be here any minute." Fred paused in the act of raising his hat and rubbing his mostly bald head. "She's coming here?" he asked incredulously, hooking a finger in the pocket of his jeans. Most shops had a uniform policy. Ben had done away with it first thing when he'd become foreman. That wasn't the only change he made, but by the time the higher-ups realized what was going on, they couldn't argue with his improved output numbers. Riley couldn't argue. This wasn't their first meeting. "Said she was." Ben carefully wiped off his 3/4-inch socket. This was their first meeting, however, in the shop. Every other time he'd been called on the carpet, he'd had to stand like a bad little schoolboy hanging his head in front of the principal's office. Never again. His sisters had graduated from high school and had several years of additional training under their belts. He could finally afford to take the risk he'd always wanted to take. Fred's eyes swept over him, taking in the grease on his t-shirt, arms, and face. It mixed with the blood he'd wiped there when his forearm had clipped a jagged piece of metal after cutting off a stubborn bolt. "Ain't you gonna clean up at all?" "Nope." He gave Fred a grin. "Won't hurt the woman to see what a working man looks like." Fred returned his grin and shrugged before turning. "See you tomorrow." "Flip the lights out for bays 1 and 2 before you go." Fred didn't answer, just hit the switches on the way out the door. Maybe he should have cleaned up, at least washed his hands and arms. But with his sisters raised, he had a hard time caring about impressing the snotty daughter of the owner of one of the biggest trucking and repair companies in the country. Riley could come to him. He didn't give a flip, because he was quitting. Chapter 2. Riley's heels clicked on the pavement. She carried her purse, not because she needed it, but because it helped to keep her hands still if she were holding something. Over the years, she'd adopted many tricks for looking like a polished professional. Her natural personality was anything but. She'd just learned how to do what needed to be done. The shop wasn't far from the smaller building that housed the offices for the main branch of Coleman Trucking, and it took less than a minute to walk there. Still, she was grateful for her jacket. At least Pennsylvania didn't cling to winter like red on blood the way Maine did. It took hardy people to live up here. An older man carrying a lunch bucket pushed the man door open. "Oh," Riley stumbled back. "Excuse me." "No, excuse me, ma'am." The man tipped his ball cap and walked through, holding the door so Riley could enter. "Thanks." It took her eyes a moment to adjust to the dimmer interior. There were 3 bays. This shop was so good, it was where the company sent their rebuilds if at all possible. It looked like there were 2 current ones. Finally, she saw movement over by the far truck. A white t-shirt stood out against the gloom. She took a deep breath, pulled from her years of dealing with her dad, and started over. Her future hinged on the outcome of this meeting. She wasn't exactly Ben Baxter's favorite person. Although she'd come a long way from that disastrous day years ago, he didn't know. She'd never gone back and tried to make it right. Once it was done, there was no point in dredging up past hurts. When she'd come back from college and started working at the shop, she'd looked for a way to try, but he never acted like he cared, and she didn't want to rock the boat. He was the best mechanic their company had. He was the reason the shop performed so well. Of course, Riley was good at her job, but she knew most of the credit belonged to Ben. If she had approached him and it hadn't gone well, he might have quit. They both pretended nothing ever happened. The little bit that they saw each other, they treated the other with professional respect. She didn't want him to quit. She didn't want their company to lose their most valuable employee, sure. But there was another reason, a bigger reason. She never said anything. It would have been too dangerous to her traitorous heart. After all the time that had gone by without explanation or apology, she couldn't expect him to believe the best of her now. The click of her heels echoed in the cavernous interior, firm and purposeful, just like she wanted. The white shirt moved. Ben's face came into focus. As always, something hot and sweet burst in her chest when she looked at him. Ruthlessly, she shoved it down. She'd ruined any chance of a relationship, brutally and on purpose. Now she had to live with her choice. "Hello, Ben." Without responding, he wiped his hands, shoved the rag in his pocket, and crossed his arms. She squeezed her purse and tried for a friendly smile. She really needed this man. "Thanks so much for meeting me." She wouldn't mention that she'd asked for him to come to her, and while he hadn't refused, he'd said that he'd be working late to pull a motor out. Did she want the truck fixed, or did she want him in her office? His chin might have lifted a fraction. So, no pleasantries. Of course not. She'd get right down to business. "What you've done in this shop over the last 4 years has been beyond amazing." He was an amazing foreman, but he wouldn't have been successful if she hadn't given him the reins to do what he needed to do, one of which was doing actual work himself. That was a huge red flag to HR, but Riley had made it work because Ben had been right. The guys under him worked better if he was working too. He filled the position of shop foreman and head mechanic. He'd trained several men over the last few years to his level. Then the bigger shops had stolen them. He didn't respond, not even an eyebrow movement. He wouldn't have any trouble talking to her dad. She jumped back in. "The biggest shop we have, the one in Pennsylvania, just outside of Brickley Springs, is also our worst performing one. I know you can turn it around. I'm here to offer you the position of shop foreman." "Wouldn't work." She ignored him. "I'm going to. Together we can implement the arrangement we have here. It's a bigger shop. We'll have some more red tape to cut through." "No." "I know we hate each other's guts," he offered helpfully. The first ever hint that they had a history. She wouldn't allow the clenching of her heart to distract her from her purpose. She lifted her chin. "Had a misunderstanding and don't get on well." "You call that a misunderstanding?" He snorted and leaned back against the corner of his massive toolbox. She pulled her lips out from between her teeth, ignoring him. It wasn't a misunderstanding at all. She'd been brutal. Because she had to. "We make a great team. You know this terminal is the best in the company. I want us to go to Pennsylvania and make that one even better." "I disagree," he said with a slight mocking tone in his voice. She ignored the tone, along with the implication that they didn't make a great team. "That's fine. We don't have to agree on everything." A few beats of silence thumped between them. "It will be a major salary increase, of course." Money would do it every time. Ben wasn't any different than any other single dad, although technically he wasn't a dad. She'd met his sisters, of course. Spruce Mountain, Maine wasn't the smallest town in the world, but because of the freedom she'd given Ben to work and manage as he saw fit, his twin sisters were around the shop. Less now that they were older. Nice girls. Not interested. His arms came down and he straightened like the conversation was over. Riley's heart quaked. She needed Ben. "It will be triple your current salary." Ben smiled, his white teeth flashing, contrasting against his tan skin. Not interested. She had to hide the quaking in her heart. There was no way she could do what needed to be done without Ben. Obviously, she was going to have to find another way to talk him into it. She couldn't admit defeat. "I'll give you a few days to think about it." Before he could turn that down too, she spun and hurried away. "Hey, watch!" Ben's warning faded out as Riley cut around the truck too close and hit the corner of the fender. It didn't hurt at first, but that stretching feeling when skin separates made bile back up in her throat. Warmth seeped down her lower leg. Rustling behind her, a muted ripping sound like paper towels being torn. Then Ben was beside her, kneeling. Blood ran down her leg, and he dabbed it with the clean towel in his hand. All the feelings that she'd fought and ignored for the past years ripped open, and she jerked back. "It's fine." Her voice quivered, and she didn't even care. She just had to get away from him. She backed up and turned as he stood slowly, the towel held in his hand fisted with white knuckles. Catching just a glimpse of resignation on his face, she headed toward the door, her heels clipping double time. She didn't stop until she was out in the fading sunlight, the door slamming behind her. The cold air hit her leg, and she felt every centimeter where the blood had seeped down. It wasn't so bad that it would need stitches. She'd seen enough injuries to know it hadn't cut deep enough. The thing that really needed to be stitched back together was her pride. Seeing him was bad enough. She couldn't stand for him to touch her. She'd end up on her knees begging him to take her back. She straightened. No, she wouldn't. High school was a long time ago. They'd both changed into different people. They didn't know each other anymore. She was still moved by the memories, not the actual man. Two heads bobbed across the parking lot toward her, and she shoved the pinching pain in her leg aside. Eve and Eden, Ben's sisters. Riley knew them well and also knew that Ben would do anything for them. Something had happened to their parents. Riley was sketchy on the details, and Ben had raised them. "Hey, girls." Riley stopped and offered a friendly smile. Ben might have a grizzly bear personality, but his sisters were sweet. "Miss Riley," Eden, the blonde twin, said. "Did you get transferred to the shop?" Riley gave a carefree laugh, shoving the last of her lingering troubles aside. "I think we all know I'd be helpless in there. And your family owns a trucking company." Eden shook her head, then laughed too. "I'd be helpless in there as well, even though Ben runs the place." Eve was the twin who took after her brother. Eve fixed trucks. Eden painted them. "Did Ben get in trouble?" Eve asked with a frown. "No." Riley tucked a stray hair behind her ear. It was getting chilly out now that the sun had sunk behind the mountain. "I had a proposition for him." "Yes, I knew it. I always knew you two were meant for each other." Eve did a little hop, then high-fived her twin. "Not that kind of proposition." Riley laughed at the twins' exuberance. You're trying to push your brother off? All he's ever done is take care of us. He needs a life. Maybe he's happy here. Yeah, the guy was gorgeous, and she felt a definite attraction, but she wouldn't wish his grumpy, miserable personality on any woman. At least, that's what she told herself. Wait, what was she saying? She cleared her throat. Or maybe he'd like a change of scenery. There's a job opening in Pennsylvania, and I offered it to him. Did he jump on it? Eden asked eagerly. He turned it down. Why? Eden asked, shoving her hands in her back pockets. Riley lifted a shoulder and adjusted her purse, thinking about Ben's flat refusal. He didn't say. The twins shared a look which made hope blossom in Riley's heart. Then it sank. Eve's lip pulled back. I think you're right. Ben's happy here in Maine. Eden nodded in agreement with a similar look. Yeah, he isn't the kind of guy who likes to pull up roots and travel around. Riley didn't want to cause strife in their family. They'd already had it hard enough. But she really needed Ben. That's too bad. It was a great opportunity. More money? Eve asked with a lifted brow. Riley nodded. Complete honesty. A lot more money. Their heads bobbed slowly, but neither seemed interested, and Riley was ready to give up hope that they would help her convince their brother to take the job. She gave it another plug. It's our company's biggest terminal, and Ben would have the highest shop position in the company. Eve's expression grew crafty. So, if it's that much a prestigious place to be, will you ever get promoted to there? Riley grinned. I actually got promoted too. Eden's mouth opened with an O. You're moving to Pennsylvania? I'm supposed to within the month. The twins looked at each other again, an expression Riley couldn't read. Despite the cooling air, she didn't move to walk away. There was something in that look she didn't understand, but it encouraged her for some reason. Did Ben know that you were going too? Eden asked casually. Riley snorted and looked off at the distant mountains. I think that was one reason he didn't want to. He'd finally be rid of me. No, he doesn't feel that way. Riley's head snapped back around, and she studied the twins. Yeah, he said a lot of times how he wouldn't be successful in his job if you hadn't been or changed the rules to accommodate his changes. Thoughts flew through her head. She'd always had a good relationship with the twins. They'd eaten in her office a few times, and she'd even taken them out for lunch when they'd been around and Ben couldn't stop working. But she always assumed that Ben had presented her in the worst possible light and they were just being nice. It was possible, she supposed, that Ben had never told the twins what she'd done to him. After all these years, it was too late for her to change it or take it back, even if he had told. What's done was done. Well, I appreciate that, but I still think that he'll be happy to see the last of me. Chapter 3. Ben set a bowl of spaghetti on the table. The little house he'd moved into at 14 when he'd run away from his dad's home after finding out his real mother lived in Maine was small but cozy. He'd not changed anything after his mother had died from complications from lupus, and his sisters weren't interested in redecorating either, which meant the kitchen was comfortably outdated and gently worn. Not that he usually paid too much attention to the decor. He made sure everything worked. Faucets fixed, cabinet doors screwed tight, and the drawers slid easily on their runners. But if the wallpaper was a faded yellow or if the fixtures were corroded, hey, at least the water came out and the lights came on. That's all he cared about. Except Riley was leaving Maine. and she wanted him to go too. Aside from Riley, he had a strong pull in Pennsylvania. His Graham had been in poor health for years. She wanted him to come home. She wanted to meet the twins who didn't even know she existed. Major coincidence that the Coleman Trucking and Repair home terminal was in Brickley Springs, his father's hometown and where his Graham still lived. Actually, not so coincidental. Brickley Springs was ideally suited for commerce. Directly between the PA Turnpike and I-80, one could go anywhere, east, west, north, or south, and fast, from Brickley Springs. It was a smart place to put a terminal. It was a great place for a truck driver, like his dad, to live. He glanced around the kitchen again as Eve put Parmesan cheese on the table and Eden pulled the garlic bread out of the oven. He supposed this wasn't much of a home, not to someone who grew up in a mansion with millions. Riley had made it perfectly clear years ago that he wasn't good enough. That had been enough to keep him from pursuing her, but not enough to keep him from noticing her. His fingers tingled and he gripped the plastic cups tighter. He'd touched her today. Hadn't meant to. Hadn't touched her in years. Shouldn't have done it.
"You're quiet tonight."
Eve poured sweet tea into the cups he'd set down. "Oh, forgot." He snapped up like he'd just remembered something important. "I'm supposed to drill you about your day."
"No."
No, they said together. He ignored the protest. He'd gotten good at ignoring protests over the years. "Did you show up on time and put in a full day's work?"
"Ben."
Eve rolled her eyes. What, was today the class day? He couldn't remember. One day a week, Eden had class instruction, and the rest of the time, she was in the shop doing hands-on work, learning to run the different airbrushes and how to get the base coats on. Auto detail painting wasn't hard, but it was exact, which was good for Eden. Who knew where her loads of artistic talent came from, but she needed the discipline of forcing herself to do the grunt work too.
"Ben, I'm out of high school and almost done with trade school. Your job is over."
You're never done being a parent. He said it in a scholarly voice like he was reading it out of a parenting book. Eden lifted her brows before chucking him on the shoulder.
"Brother. You're never done being a brother." "Well, I had a good day,"
Eve said, running interference with her twin like he didn't notice.
"And you can grill me on it if you want."
Ben paused with his fork in midair. Did that what's-his-face keep his fingers to himself?
"After I set his pants on fire with the hand torch."
Ben matched her grin. Glad you listened to me, girl. She pushed her spaghetti around on her plate.
"Midge said I could start on motors next month if I keep on doing as well as I've been doing on brakes and oil changes."
You didn't tell him you already know how to gut it and rebuild?
"No, I'm hoping he'll help me with the electrical parts. These new motors are all computerized, and you only worked with me on the old stuff."
That's what the independent guys want. If you don't work for a big shop, you'll be seeing a lot of old stuff.
"Why did you turn Riley down?"
Eden asked. After raising his sisters for the last decade and a half, he should be used to these sudden topic changes. His head still spun, probably more from thinking about Riley than the abrupt change in subject.
"She told us it was a huge promotion for you." "Yeah, apparently the shop in Pennsylvania is much bigger than the one you're at now."
He hated it when they ganged up on him like this. As always, he tried not to let them know it bothered him. You guys know I've always said after you're out of school, I was going to open my own place. I'm planning on quitting. Plus, they didn't exactly know that they had family in Pennsylvania. If he moved to Brickley Springs, he'd have to tell them. They'd have to meet Graham. It wasn't like the town was so big they'd never hear about someone else with the same last name. His brothers' first names didn't exactly fade into the woodwork either. He hid his smirk, waiting until Eve was seated before he said, "Let's pray." It always bothered him when someone decided to use the dinner table blessing to pray for their great-aunt Mildred and the health and well-being of all their 17 cousins. Not that there wasn't a time and place to have a long chat with the Lord, just not while his food was getting cold. It was only a few seconds later that he said, "Amen," and Eve started like they'd never been interrupted.
I'd like to go south.
He should have prayed for Great-Aunt Mildred.
It would be warmer there.
Eden chimed in. Ben dished himself some spaghetti. No seafood in PA. They weren't deterred.
But warm more months of the year than August,
Eden argued, giving him the cheese and taking some garlic bread for herself. True, he said, shoving food in his mouth, hoping to set an example that his sisters would follow. They were sliding into dangerous territory as long as they were talking about Pennsylvania.
How do you know?
Both twins' eyes moved to him and stayed. He hated it when they looked at him like that. He swallowed, having avoided this confession their whole lives. I lived there before I knew about my mom and you guys. A little pang hit his chest. They had uncles, his half-brothers. But if those guys had turned out anything like their dad, he wanted his sisters far away from them. Which is exactly the reason he'd never told them about the family. Graham had mentioned once that the oldest, Torque, was in prison. After that, he'd said he didn't want to talk about them. No way he was letting his sisters around men like that, even if they were their half-brothers. When Graham had first reached out to him, he'd told her the twins didn't know about their Pennsylvania relatives, and it needed to stay that way if she wanted him to pick up the phone when she called. At first, he'd not cared much about Graham. She was part of his old life with his dad, which he'd left. But the woman was stubborn and gritty and truly cared about him and his sisters. She'd wormed her way into his heart, and he loved her fiercely. He'd been tempted over the years to at least tell them about Graham, but being a brother and single parent to twins was hard enough. He didn't need to add any more drama to his life. He didn't want to go to Pennsylvania, because Riley was in Maine.
You lived there?
Eden asked incredulously. He ignored Eden's question, but Eve was like a dog with a bone, and she fired off.
Why not move to Pennsylvania, work at the big shop, and see if you like it? You could always start your own shop in another year or so if you decide you wanted to. It's not like you hate your job or anything.
Eden tag-teamed her. He shoved more spaghetti in his mouth and ignored them. They were right. He didn't hate his job, but he did chafe at the restrictions. Something in him wanted to be his own boss, to prove he could do it. No better time than now, when his sisters were no longer dependent on him for everything.
Maybe you'd find a girl down there,
Eve said with a sly grin.
Yeah.
Eden jabbed her fork in the air to press her point.
Now that you can't use us as an excuse anymore.
He swallowed, tilting his head. I never used you as an excuse.
You sure did. We'd ask you why you didn't marry, and you'd say you couldn't find a girl who wanted a ready-made family.
I was kidding. Although it had been true. Most girls pretended to like his sisters, but weren't really interested in raising kids that weren't their own. Heck, a lot of women didn't even want their own kids. Plus, there was only one woman who had ever challenged him to the depths of his soul. Too bad she'd scorched her way there. Their looks said they didn't believe him. He held up the hand that held his garlic bread. Okay, fine, I used you as an excuse. They looked smug. Eve said.
And now you don't have us as an excuse anymore. So you can take the job in Pennsylvania.
He lifted a brow at Eden. You're going to hurt someone with that fork. Surprise flashed across Eden's face, chased by a sheepish grin. She jabbed her utensil into her spaghetti. He relented. Okay, say I did take it. He eyed them over his spaghetti. And I moved to PA. Where are you two going to live? They looked at each other, and he felt a surge of triumph. Ha! They hadn't even thought of that. Then Eve shrugged.
We'll come with you.
Chapter 4. Ben walked into the Coleman shop at 5 a.m., flipping on the lights and turning up the heat. He started coffee in the cold pot. There was no night shift at this shop. There would be in Pennsylvania. He pushed that thought out of his head. Maybe a little of him was tempted to go, but if he were being honest with himself, the main temptation for him was because Riley was going. He didn't even really like her, even if he was attracted to her, but he'd kind of gotten used to having her around. That's what he told himself anyway. He wasn't going to follow her around like a lovesick puppy. She'd kicked him out of the way with her high-dollar shoes once. No one had ever accused him of being a slow learner. He stood on the frame rails of the gutted truck from last night and had just slipped the liner in piston number 10 when the door opened with a blast of cold air. Odd, since his guys weren't scheduled to come in until 7, and none of them ever showed up at 6, which was about the time it should be. He couldn't know for sure since he wasn't wearing a watch, and his phone lay over on the work table with the pieces of the big diesel engine that he'd torn down yesterday. The light click of heels echoed off the high ceiling of the garage, and Ben's body had the same odd reaction it always did when Riley came near. His heart thundered, while dread pooled in his stomach. His brain began issuing rapid-fire instructions to stay away, keep the walls up, don't let her in, while his mouth went dry and his whole body ached to draw closer. He tapped the liner. This job needed precision and concentration. Maybe she'd leave.
Ben?
Riley, he said without looking up. He needed to go get another liner, but he'd rather stand above her than get down and go fetch it, so he pretended to be busy.
You can quit pretending you're busy. I might not know much, but I know the tapper you're holding isn't used anywhere near that bolt you're playing with.
Busted. He straightened. You need something, 'cause some of us around here actually work, while some of us just sit in our office keeping Daddy happy. That was low, and he felt bad as soon as the words were out of his mouth. Normally people considered him nice. Riley brought out the bitterness he still harbored. If his barbs hit their mark, her face didn't flinch. Carefully bland.
I just figured I'd ask if you changed your mind.
He put his hand on the windshield and looked down at her. You know, I actually did think about that last night. You can't do what needs to be done without me. To her credit, she looked him in the eye. Thankfully, she couldn't see his brain going around like the fins of a turbo.
I can't.
Her chin jutted out.
You're right. The shop needs to be turned around. I know I can handle the office side of things, and I can get things set up so you can work your magic outside.
He narrowed his eyes. She was patronizing him. She threw a hand up.
I'm serious. I know you don't like me.
This time she did look away. She caught her lips between her teeth. He'd almost kissed those lips. A long time ago. Squaring her shoulders, she turned back to face him.
I'm sorry.
Her face seemed sincere. Something else flitted across it. Something that looked like regret. He had to have read it wrong.
I know what I did was rude.
He waved his hand, dismissing her words. He wasn't going to admit, not for anything, that the way she dumped him still hurt. He wasn't carrying a torch for her, and he didn't really even like her, other than the dumb attraction he felt every time she was in the room. Forget it. It's history. If you're still thinking about it, you need to let it go. If his heart had eyes, they'd be rolling right now, but he kept his face clear.
I wanted you to know.
Forget it. Maybe his words came out a little more forcefully than they needed to. Her mouth hung open before she snapped it shut. Her face lost the vulnerable look, and his stomach tightened because he was the one who'd erased that soft sweetness that sat so beautifully on her. Her eyes narrowed.
Fine. When you're ready to let me explain, I'm ready to tell you.
He shook his head. Then, because he needed another liner, he stepped on the steer tire and jumped down. She stepped back. Is that all you wanted? He asked dismissively. He'd never get anything accomplished if he had to fight the desire to look at her constantly. She waited so long to answer he thought she wasn't going to.
You're right. I need you. Will you reconsider?
Nope. She pressed her lips together and turned. He didn't watch her walk away. Chapter 5. Riley stepped into her office and shut the door, leaning against it. She had her own office here at least. It wasn't a corner office, and this was their smallest terminal. But it was better than being in an open room with flimsy partitions separating her from her coworkers, which is where she could end up if she didn't manage to do the impossible thing her dad was demanding of her. She blew out a breath. That visit was a fail. Without Ben, she couldn't do what her dad wanted her to. There was no way. Even if Ben would help her make the changes necessary without actually taking the job, she might have a chance. But he didn't want to have anything to do with her. Maybe if she could have explained why she'd done what she did, but she let it go for so long. He probably wouldn't believe her anyway. And a few sentences of explanation wouldn't erase years of resentment. She'd never done anything more, but she hadn't needed to. A tap on her door startled her. She straightened her shoulders. She'd just have to do it by herself, or find someone else like Ben. Like there was anyone else in the world like Ben. Brushing her hands down her skirt, she turned and opened the door.
Hey, Audrey, come on in.
Her personal secretary stepped through the doorway gingerly.
He said no.
Riley nodded. Audrey's face fell. Even though no one else was in that early, she finished walking in and closed the door behind her. She tilted her head.
Maybe you're not giving yourself enough credit. Maybe you can do this without Ben.
Riley forced her lips to turn up.
Thanks for the support. I've learned a lot over the past few years, but Ben is the reason the shop is successful. Maybe his way of doing things won't work in Pennsylvania. I mean, they're a different breed down there.
She shrugged.
It takes a certain kind of hardiness to live in Maine.
They smiled, survivors of Maine's unforgiving and unending winters.
It's not for everyone,
Riley agreed. She pushed her hair back.
I appreciate you trying, but we both know without Ben, I'm never going to be able to do what my dad expects.
Audrey fingered the folders in her hand.
Then maybe it's time you stopped trying.
Riley stared at her. Stop trying to please her dad? But she worked for his company. She planned to run it someday.
I can't. I might as well quit today and find a new job. He's not just my dad, he's my boss. It doesn't matter what he is. You can't do impossible things for him.
Audrey wrapped her arms around the folders and held them close to her chest.
I'm not trying to tell you to rebel against your dad. Of course, you can't do that. But every time he tells you to do something, no matter how impossible, you kill yourself trying to impress him.
Audrey's eyes softened, her voice lowered.
He never appreciates it, just acts like that's what's expected.
Riley's mind reeled. In today's world, it was perfectly acceptable to thumb one's nose at one's parents. That didn't make it right. She couldn't do it, although it was difficult to put words as to why.
That's what makes me feel so good. Like Dad knows I can do it and doesn't expect anything less from me. I wouldn't be as good as I am if it weren't for his high expectations. I just thought you might be tired of trying to meet those high expectations, especially when he doesn't appreciate you. Also, when you need other people to uproot their lives so you don't disappoint your dad.
Riley sighed and walked to her window, looking out on the closed garage bay.
You're definitely right about that. I can't expect other people to help me meet Dad's unreasonable expectations.
She turned.
I didn't ask you to come.
She gave Audrey a meaningful look.
And I offered Ben a huge promotion. It's not like he was giving up a good job and salary to work for peanuts while I built an empire for my dad.
Audrey looked down at the ground.
You're right. She paused. I just know you made at least one life-changing mistake because of what your dad thought, and building his business was more important than making a life for yourself.
Audrey looked Riley square in the eye.
You don't have a life. One day, you might regret that.
Audrey was almost certainly talking about what happened with Ben years ago. It was over and done with. Why did it seem like it was haunting her? Although she was right on more counts, too. Her friend circle had grown smaller and smaller until she was closer to the people she saw at work than she was with any actual friends. She just didn't have time. There were always reports to compile, data to analyze, employee issues to supervise. Sure, she had people in place to do all those things, but as the person in charge, she needed to keep her finger in everything, which she did. Only Ben had free rein to do whatever he wanted. She'd never told him that, but he'd probably figured it out by now. Whatever he decided, she supported. Still, she knew exactly what was going on in the shop, because she answered to her dad for everything. She didn't socialize with coworkers because she was the boss. Audrey was the closest thing she had to a friend anymore. She let out a breath and brushed off the front of her skirt.
If that bothers you so much, you should be happy that I asked Ben to move to Pennsylvania with me.
No surprise flickered across Audrey's face. So, office gossip had made the rounds. Audrey's finger flicked the edge of the folder she held.
Rumor has it that Ben wants to start his own company. Maybe you'd be better off letting someone else take your place and helping him start a business. You said yourself you two make a great team.
A little shot of excitement pinched in her chest. Ben and she could build a successful business. She was sure of it. She pursed her lips.
Problem is, Ben didn't ask me.
She allowed a small, meaningful pause.
I did ask him. He said no. Maybe Ben needs the past resolved,
Audrey said softly.
I tried. He wouldn't listen. Maybe you should make him.
She loved Audrey, and she'd miss her. Miss having someone so close to her who wasn't afraid to speak her mind and didn't hold it against Riley that sometimes she was an idiot. But it did get tiring having one's conscience in one's face all the time.
I think it's best if we just let that go. I'm leaving, he's not. And right now, my biggest problem is that I need someone as good as Ben to be my shop manager.
Audrey held out the folders.
I went through several employment portals last night, nationwide. I printed off pertinent info, one folder for each prospect.
Riley took the folders. The ball in her chest eased slightly.
Thanks so much.
Audrey didn't let go of the folders right away. She waited for Riley to look at her.
But you're not going to find someone like Ben, and I'm not just talking about an employee.
Riley's heart had to agree with that. She squeezed the folders tighter than necessary.
He hates me. There's a fine line between love and hate.
Heard the boss lady was packing up and heading to the BS terminal. Danny slapped the hood of the truck Ben stood beside, up to his elbows in rods and pistons. Ben kept his head down, focused on working in the tight space without pinching his fingers any more than necessary. Hope they don't hire a jerk to take her place. Ben grunted. His wrench slipped off, the grease making it difficult to get a solid hold. He tried again. She pretty much lets us do whatever we want. Heck, if we worked at any other shop, you'd be sitting on your little throne watching us minions work. Ben stopped and looked at Danny. Versus this one where you sit on the throne and watch me work? He pulled the lip back, not sure how effective his expression was with all the grease that had to be on his face. Danny laughed but walked on. I can take a hint, boss man. I've already changed a rear and a turbo today. You get that tranny pulled out before 12, and lunch is on me. Ben smiled to himself. Danny could do it, but he'd not be able to stop and talk the rest of the morning. It'll be done, he called from the other side of the shop. You better get your big pocketbook out. Ben laughed, knowing Danny would probably just want hot dogs from the corner gas station. He'd want to go get them, too, because he thought the cashier was cute. The other two guys in the shop joined in, teasing that Ben used $100 bills as toilet paper. After a couple more shouted challenges and insults, things settled down and the guys were putting a push on to see who'd get the most done before lunch. Ben set a bolt on the steer tire and reached in to get the other one off. Things were running really well here. He'd done the best job he could do. He'd figured, now that the twins were grown, it was time to move on. But he'd been dragging his feet. Change was hard, but he wasn't afraid of it. He knew why he hadn't moved. She was 100 yards away in the office across the parking lot. Stupid heart of his fell one time and wouldn't give up. He hadn't been able to get it to beat for anyone else, hard as he tried. Maybe if he stayed here and Riley moved to Pennsylvania, he'd finally be able to get her out of his mind. Or maybe if he moved to Pennsylvania, they'd finally be able to get past the issue that had lain between them like Antarctica, uncrossable, except for the strongest and most determined person. It's what he wanted, but he didn't think he could swallow his pride enough to follow the woman who'd humiliated him across 6 states like a lovesick dog. Chapter 6. Later that week, Ben sat out on the cold port swing by himself. He leaned against the armrest, one boot propped on the swing, one solid on the floor, pushing slowly. It was still cold, but not the frigid cold of a Maine winter. 40 degrees was relative. The twins had gone out with their friends. He never went to bed until they were home. Yeah, they might be over 18 and all that, but there was no way he'd be able to sleep until he knew they were safe. His phone buzzed at his side, and he jumped like he always did, His first thought it was the police, or the morgue. One glance at the number had his forehead wrinkling. He didn't recognize the area code, although it looked familiar. 2 more seconds, then his stomach cramped. He remembered now. It was a Pennsylvania area code, just like Graham's. Not her number. He swiped the button before reaching behind him and hooking his hand on the swing again. With his other hand, he put the phone to his ear. "Hello?"
Is this Ben Baxter?
The female voice was cultured, like a rich blue blood. Not sure why such a woman would be calling him, he answered shortly. "Yeah."
This is Cassidy Baxter.
Baxter, his last name. The woman paused. Ben's mind raced. His dad had no brothers, but this could be his sister-in-law? He waited.
I'm married to Torque.
Torque was the oldest of his 3 half-brothers. His dad had given the younger 3 boys weird truck names. Occasionally, Ben had wondered how he'd escaped that curse, but what he'd found that caused him to run had given him all the answers he needed. He'd always assumed his brothers would turn out just like their dad, and Ben couldn't save everyone, so he'd focused on his sisters, his full-blooded sisters. But this woman, Cassidy, had an educated edge to her voice.
I'm your sister-in-law.
He rolled his eyes. Maybe she did think he was stupid since he wasn't saying anything. "I figured. Torque, Tough, and Turbo." His half-brothers. They were always in the back of his mind, especially since he'd been talking to his Graham. She'd never mentioned them other than the one time she'd said Torque was in prison, and he'd threatened to hang up if she ever mentioned them again. She'd never made him feel bad for not visiting or having any contact. That hadn't stopped him from telling the biggest lie of his life to her several years ago.
That's right. Tough and Turbo are both married too.
She cleared her throat.
Anyway, I'm sure you realize I used the internet to find you. I've had your contact information for a while.
Her voice softened.
I know Torque would love to talk to you, but that's not why I'm calling.
Okay. His little brother would love to talk to him. His little brother, who had been in prison, who was married to this articulate, cultured woman. It made him curious.
I'm at the hospital. They think Graham had a heart attack last night.
Ben's heart rammed to a stop. Guilt that he had never taken his sisters to meet her, never even told them about her, tightened his throat. His boot thudded off the swing onto the porch. The chain cut into his fingers. Cassidy continued.
She asked for you.
She paused.
She wants to see you, and your wife and sisters.
Graham. He'd neglected her in favor of his mother and sisters, and now she lay dying in a hospital. He couldn't swallow the lump in his throat. Guilt. She wanted to see his sisters. He could do that. His wife? Lying was never the solution. He could remember his mother saying that on her deathbed as clearly as though she sat on the swing in the dark with him this second. It had been when he'd said he was going to get a job, and he was going to lie on the application and say he was 18 instead of 16. He hadn't felt he had any other choice, since his dad was gone and his mother was dying. If he hadn't lied, he wouldn't have been able to keep his sisters. The lie to his Graham? Not as necessary. She'd asked if he'd ever gotten married, and he said yes. Stupid, stupid man. Such a dumb, unnecessary lie. He just didn't want her to think he was like his dad, moving from woman to woman to woman. A wife and children in one state, a wife and children in another state, at the same time. There were laws against that. God's laws. Man's laws. He wanted to be different. Lying had been a stupid solution. Cassidy was silent on the other end. Tell her the truth. But he didn't want to admit to lying, and he didn't want to admit to losing a wife he never had. He'd been worried about his brothers turning out like their dad. Maybe they were worried about the same thing with him. He was the oldest, too. He couldn't lose face. It would be hard enough to go back and face the family he'd run from. He couldn't do it from a position of weakness. Finally, Cassidy spoke again.
The doctors aren't sure how much longer she'll last. She's stable, and they're conducting tests, but it is touchy.
Ben leaned his head back, looking up at the porch ceiling. He couldn't disappoint his Graham. His dad had never given two hoots about him. His mother was gone. Graham was the only adult in his family who had ever cared. But he couldn't stand to have her find out he'd lied, that he didn't really have a family, didn't even have a life, to be honest. Headlights cut through the night. A car turned slowly into their short drive. The twins were home. Ben felt like the world was closing in on him. He had to tell Eve and Eden they had a grandmother who was alive and wanted to see them. He had to admit to his Graham he wasn't married and never had been. And after he'd so bluntly turned down Riley's offer of a promotion, he needed to ask for extended time off. Normally, he hoarded his vacation like a pack rat, but he'd used it all up for the year this past summer when the twins and he had taken the trip of a lifetime. They'd gone across the country and seen the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Pacific Ocean, and a ton of other sights they'd all only dreamed about. It had been the best time ever, but he had 0 vacation time left. Double crap.
You know what? I don't even know why I called. This was a total waste of time.
Cassidy's cultured voice throbbed with irritation.
I'm sorry I bothered you,
she said, not sounding the slightest bit sorry, but sounding a lot jacked off. Wait, he said. She quit talking, but the silence, even over the phone, pulsed with judgment and anger. I'm just surprised. I'll be down to see Graham.
With your family.
The words could have been cut out of diamond, sharp edges and all hardness. Ben closed his eyes. With my family. Cassidy rattled off the name of the hospital and the room number.
I'll text it to you,
she added, like she didn't want to give him any excuses for not showing up. Thanks.
When should I tell her you'll be here?
Car doors slammed. The twins would be out here in less than a minute. He needed to figure out what he was going to tell them. What was he going to tell them? Soon.
Lovely,
Cassidy said, the one word dripping with sarcasm. Then her voice changed.
I don't know you or anything about you, but I do know you have 3 brothers here who would really like to know you and your family.
She paused.
I'll see you. Soon.
Then she hung up. Ben dropped his phone into his lap, stretching both hands behind his head and holding on to the swing chain. Why had he lied? What was he going to do about it now? Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.